All right. Hello. It is very nice to meet you, and I hope that you can hear me. And I do apologize for not.
Sesin gelmiyor Majid yalnız.
Can you hear me? I'm sorry, I do not speak Turkish. But all right. I think that you can hear me now, and everything should go fine. All right. Very well. Perfect. And I'm going to share my screen now. You have to be able to see this too. Yes, perfect. So, thank you very much for giving me the chance to talk here. And I understand that scientists may wonder, what does a philosopher have to share about the topics in information processing and computation? And to be quite honest, I have to say that I do not have much to share. I try, however, to depict with a broad brush a picture of where a collaboration may take place between information scientists that are coming from a background of information processing and computer sciences, and neuroscientists and psychologists on the one hand, and philosophers on the other hand. So, and I have a terrible sense of timing, so most probably I'm trying to give up the talk, and I have to just squeeze the last parts of the talk together. So, this is the structure of the talk. At this stage, I say hello, thank you very much for inviting me to this wonderful event. Then I begin with an ontological question, and that ontological question would be with us in the rest of the talk. When speaking of ontology, philosophers are mainly concerned with issues of existence, what there is, what does exist. Then I begin by speaking of philosophy and ancient philosophy. At that, I begin to speak about Aristotle and Descartes' conceptions, respective conceptions of the self and the mind, and explain why this classical conception, despite its prima facie appeal, despite its intuitive attraction, is not plausible these days. Then I'm comparing that with a scientific picture of the self, and I conclude that that scientific picture, although it overcomes some of the problems that pertain to substantivalism, it is not 100% reliable either, because it seems to lack something important. And then I try to amend that shortcoming by appealing to some sort of information theoretical conception of the self. I do not know whether I couldn't speak much about that information theoretical aspect because it comes rather at the end of the talk, but at least I can show, hopefully, where the bone of contention is what's important in that question. So let us begin with an ontological question, the question of what there exists. Even before speaking of the self and the mind, let's take the ontological question, the question of what there exists, at a simpler level. Are there such things as chairs and trees in the world? And the answer, most probably for most of you, would be yes, of course there are chairs and trees, but what kind of dumb philosophical question is that? But the thing is that nowadays, most of us who are engaging in academic activity hear about what happens at the level of many particle physics, at the subparticle level. And it seems that what seems to be like chairs and trees to us at the subparticle level is basically constituted by fields of energy, things that do not possess most of the properties that bestow upon an individual object its identity. So it seems that at the subparticle level, there are things in our ontology, if we want to know what there exists, and if we want to be scientific minded about that. We have to consent that at least at the subparticle level, there are things that do not possess these properties of familiar objects. They are not like chairs and trees at all, because we could, if you go to this subparticle physics, for example, through Bose-Einstein formulation statistics, you could grant that some of the particles that are there do not possess these properties that makes them individual objects. So, and it seems that chairs and trees and everything else is basically consists of what happens at that subparticle level. So, from a philosophical question, especially for philosophers who are scientific minded, the question of the existence of ordinary objects would be rather interesting because we could not consent their existence as readily as we could once upon a time know that we know about the scientific facts about what happens at the subparticle level. And if you want to say that, all right, the world, if you want to speak about what there exists in the world, we consent that in the world there exist both individual objects, such as chairs and trees on the one hand, and things that are at subparticle level, such as, I don't know, bosons and Higgs and that sort of stuff. We have to be able to provide some sort of rational, viable picture of the relation between these two levels of existence. No, I'm not concerned with philosophy of physics at this talk. I'm concerned with the question of the self, the existence of the self, and the question of, are there such things as the selves? Is the real world include such things as the selves? Are the selves populating this real world? And again, if it was some sort of in-place conference, I was expected to hear some wonder to be hearing from you to say what kind of dumb question is that. Of course, there are selves in the world. We are selves and we exist. So naturally, yes, selves exist in the world. But again, I try to show that the question is a bit more sophisticated than that. And it was not that sophisticated once upon a time. Once upon a time, the question of the existence of the self was quite straightforward. I would refer to Aristotle here to speak about this issue. And I do not think that Aristotle was really made of a stone, historically, but he had very interesting ideas about not only self and mind, but everything else that exists. For him, the world was mainly populated by primary substances. So things such as this chair, the tree, the computer, the table, every kind of individual object that you can imagine was some sort of brick in the ontology wall for Aristotle. So when we speak of existence for Aristotle, the primary thing that existed were individual substances, such as horses and trees and chairs and stones and that sort of stuff. So a primary substance is basically an individual object, and it has some sort of thisness. So you can refer to an individual object when you want to, a substance, when you want to show it, and clarify by saying that I'm speaking about this thing or that thing. So they have this kind of thisness in them. And there are other categories of being, for example, quantity, relation, place, state, but all of them depend on the substances for their existence. So the substance is the bearer of the properties, and it retains its identity over time. So take the example of a tree, and I think that most of you who are working in meant to have seen this specific tree. So the tree exists, it is an individual object, it retains its identity over time. So if you have seen this tree a few months ago, and if you see it a few months from now, you have little doubt that the tree is retaining its identity over time. And it had some property. For example, it has a color, it has certain height, and the color depends for its existence on the tree. So it doesn't make sense for the color to exist without depending on the tree. The color of a tree, the green of the tree couldn't exist independently of the tree itself. But the tree is the bearer of the properties. So the tree is the specific thing that retains its thisness, and it is the bearer of the properties, and other properties such as the color of the tree, the age, the size, and so on, depend on the tree for their existence. And Aristotle's conception of the self comes more or less in the same way. So the mind or psyche or the self for Aristotle is an individual substance. It is the bearer of the properties of a person, such as his passions, his or her passions, thoughts, emotions. These depend on the person for their existence. It doesn't make sense for an emotion to exist without depending for its existence on a person. And the self retains its identity over time. So the young boy here, the infant, and the old gentleman, they are the same person because the self, the substance, retain its identity over time. It might be the case, and I think that this is certainly the case, that their physical constitution is completely changed over the time. They retain their identity just because the old man gets old or the molecules are changed and that sort of stuff. He doesn't become some other person. And one other aspect of Aristotle taught is his helomorphism, which is another Greek term, meaning that everything is a compound of the form and the matter for Aristotle. I think that this notion is important. I will return to this notion at the end of the talk when I speak about the information theoretical aspects of the self. So everything that you take, a chair, for example, has some matter. This is, for example, wood, and it has the form, and it is the form that bestows upon the chair its thisness. If the chair doesn't have the form of a chair, it wouldn't be a form. But the thing is that in order to exist for every substance, the form and the matter have to be combined, have to get together. The matter without form is not the specific thing. So a piece of wood without having the form of a chair is not a chair. And the form couldn't exist independently of the matter. It doesn't make for a chair, the form of the chair to exist independently without being embodied in a specific chair. And it is also the case for all living organisms. For them too, the form and matter are mixed together. In some sense, the psyche or the mind is the form of the organism. But the thing is that the organism itself, the self or the person, is the combination of the form and the matter, the psyche and the body. And there are many diverse kind of substantivalism in the history of philosophy. I just refer to another form of substantivalism, and I understand that it is sounding like a talk in history of philosophy. It is not a talk in history of philosophy. I'm selecting aspects that would be useful for my talk, and I'm a philosopher at any rate, so I can hardly justify that. So this yellowish gentleman who is René Descartes is also a great defendant of substantivalism. For him too, the mind or the self is a substance. However, he doesn't advocate Aristotelian helomorphism. He doesn't think that the self or the substance is a combination of the form and the matter. For him, the substance is the self-substance, and it is a piece of his discourse on method. I highlighted part of it for you. For him, the substance of the self is only the mind. It is distinct from the body, and its main property is thinking. So, although both Descartes and Aristotle are advocating substantivalism, or assuming that the self is an individual person, is someone that retains its identity over time and is the bearer of the properties of the self, such as emotions and passions and thoughts and that sort of stuff, ideas. There is a great difference between them. For Aristotle, every substance, including the self, is a combination of the form and the matter, the mind and the body. But for Descartes, although he emphasizes from every now and then, so he sometimes speaks vaguely, although he speaks of the fact that they are combined together, mingled together, the soul and the body, he eventually defends something that borders on substance dualism, assuming that the substance, the self-substance, is completely different from the body. And the arguments that Descartes makes for this dualism have been criticized. I think that since the very beginning, since he presented his ideas, his argumentation have been criticized rather severely by contemporaries. And well, the good news is that the history of philosophy part of our talk is past. I just recap quickly. So the the point is that substantivalism is intuitively appealing. I mean, it makes sense to us to think of ourselves, at least to the extent that the issue of self and mind is at issue. It makes sense for us to assume that we are individual substances, because we assume that we retain our identity over time. I think that when I become old, as I grow older, I'm not becoming someone else. It seems that I exist regardless of whether my age or my height or that sort of thing, the color of my beard. It seems that I exist constantly through time. I retain my identity over time. And it seems that my properties depend on my substance, my age, my height, and my immense knowledge of philosophy. All of these things depend on me for their existence. And dualism too is sort of intuitively appealing. So, for example, if I have my hands amputated, if my hands get cut or my feet, it doesn't make me someone else. Or if I shave my beard, it doesn't make me someone else, because I think that intuitively it makes sense to us to assume that we are persons whose essence is thinking, and the shape of our body or what happens to our body doesn't affect our personality or our self much. So I want to say that there's some kind of intuitive appeal, attraction to these old views. But despite that, substantivalism, I would say, lost its charm. There have been still great advocates of substantivalism until very recently, such as Friedrich Strawson, the great British philosopher, who has been a great advocate of substantivalism, the Kantian version of substantivalism in his great individuals. But I think that substantivalism lost part of its charm. A reason for that comes from philosophy again. So there have been great philosophers such as David Hume and even Immanuel Kant, who have revolted against these classical ideas of substantivalism, helomorphism, and dualism. But again, we do not want to engage in history of philosophy too seriously. So I would rather consider a different line of, I don't want to say that argumentation against substantivalism. I will consider another bunch of reasons for distancing from substantivalism. And it comes from science. The question is what science tells us about the existence of the self. And it seems that, and while speaking of science, most of the time we are thinking in terms of computational neuroscience, cognitive psychology, that sort of stuff, the stuff that is coming out to light rather recently, and it is heavily affected from physics, although what psychologists are doing is not completely the same thing as physicists are doing. And although I do not want to say that psychology could be reduced to physics, because it couldn't, the thing is that it seems that neuroscience and computation and psychology could have their validity confirmed to some extent, to the extent that it could clarify the relation between their theories and physics. So, and the thing is that it seems that when we look at this debate from a scientific point of view, we do not find much reason for thinking of the self in terms of a substance. So I'm going to speak about the ontological status of the self and the mind, but again, let's begin from somewhere simpler. So for Aristotle, this chair and this tree are individual substances. They do exist. So I assume that if you ask an Aristotelian what there exists, he comes with the ready answer that yes, individual objects exist, a chair exists, a tree exists, a stone exists, I don't know. Me and you exist, and it makes perfect sense. But in light of scientific finding, we understand that what we regard to be a chair is constituted by different kind of reaction between different forces of nature. So in true sense, in true scientific sense, if we want to know what there exists, we have to go dig deeper and look deeper into the knowledge that is revealed to us by our scientific theories. And scientific theories reveal facts about what happens at the level of many particle physics that do not consist clearly with this intuitively appealing, commonsensical image of the existence of things, individual objects and things like that. So, and apart, as I mentioned in the beginning of my speech, a great part of time and energy of philosophers of physics consists of explaining the apparent disparity between the scientific image and the ordinary everyday image. So how we could explain the existence, justify the existence of individual objects such as this chair on the base, when we know that basically they constitute by things that do not show the properties of individual objects. Look, this chair couldn't be under this tree and at my room at the same time. It should be either under the tree or at my room. It couldn't be simultaneously in both places. It is a great belief in classical philosophy that there is no entity without identity. And if the chair is at two places at the same time, it is not identical itself and it does not exist. But it seems that when we look at things at the level of fundamental physics, subparticular states do not satisfy this property of identity of indiscernibles. Things could be at different places at the same time, and and things become complicated. So, what happens to the notion of the self? So, once upon a time, we had very clear notion of the existence of a person as a substance, as a combination of form and matter. But the thing is that when we dig deeply into our scientific finding, it doesn't think that our modern science justifies the existence of something such as the self. So it makes room for eliminativism, for example, about the self. Let me speak about eliminativism. I hope that those far you followed what I said, or you believe that what I said made perfect sense, or is nonsense, or whatever. So there are notions such as hope. I hope you understand what I say. And there are notions such as belief. You believe that what I say is worthwhile, or rubbish, or whatever. The thing is that and philosophers are calling them propositional attitudes. And this was a great tendency between scientific-minded philosophers, such as Churchland, who have contributed richly to philosophy of neuroscience and cognitive science recently. That if we take our scientific findings seriously, we couldn't assume that most of folk psychology or talk about hopes and beliefs and that sort of thing produce a valid theoretical vocabulary in terms of, and cannot possess plausible psychological explanation. So if we look in our best scientific theories, theories of neuroscience and neurology, and if we look at brain and nervous system closely, we do not find such things as hopes and, I don't know, desires and that sort of things there. So they suggested that perhaps it's best to just eliminate this kind of folk psychological talk of desires and hopes and states of mind and that sort of thing. And I think that the same attitude has been also pursued in philosophy of cognitive science and mind, in philosophy of selfhood. So Thomas Metzinger, for example, who is a brilliant philosopher and psychologist, in a number of publications, including these two books, Being No One and The Ego to Know, suggests that there are no such things as selves in the world. His argumentation for the non-existence of the selves was basically the same along the lines that have been unfolded by Churchlands before, by some great eliminativists before him. So it seems that the self, at least the substantival self, do not contribute to or theoretical, either of philosophical or scientific source. And it seems that we could easily discount the existence of the self from more philosophical and psychological talk. So there has been some sort of, there are scientific grounds for just getting disposed of the substantivalist self. And there are, so Metzinger is not the only one, and eliminativism is not the only trend. There is also a strong pluralist tendency to go beyond the substantivalism. So Sean Gallagher, for example, who is again a very great philosopher and philosopher of cognitive science, also presented a theory of a pattern theory, which says that there are no such things as individual selves in the world. So just to repeat what I said earlier, according to the substantivalism, the self, the individual self, is the building block, one of the primary blocks of the ontology, and it retains its identity and individuality over time. No, digging deep into psychological findings, scientific findings, Gallagher argues that there is no such thing as an individual self, to the extent that our scientific findings are at issue. What we can find there are complex and sufficient patterns of certain contributors, none of which on their own is necessary or essential to any particular self. So this is this social aspect of the self. This is this, for example, linguistic aspect of the self. There is semantic aspect of the self. There are biological, narrative, autobiographical, I don't know, several other aspects of the self, 8 or 10 altogether. But none of them could be related together to constitute what could be considered an individual self in the ordinary substantivalist way. And the reasons that these philosophers provide are more or less in line with reasons that David Hume and Kant provided previously, that neither we could find anything resembling an individual self on the basis of our best scientific fact, nor does it serve any purpose to speculate, to stipulate an individual self, a substantival self, into our philosophical and psychological discourse. So perhaps it's better to get disposed of the self altogether. I think I still have 10 minutes in order to finish my talk and go to the question and answers. So, and I think that I will be able to engage with the more information theoretic side in this 10 minutes. So, there are diverse reasons for going beyond eliminativism and pluralism. So, I think that even in the context of cognitive science and neuroscience, we could argue that there could be reasons for assuming that we indeed need some sort of unified, integrated theoretical entity that could take the place of the substantial self. I realized that we couldn't restore the concept of the substantial self, in the sense that was at issue in the works of Aristotle and Descartes. But I still think, and I have argued, that we need some sort of unified, integrating entity that could be stipulated within the context of our scientific enterprise of the self, to give sense to our scientific theories of the selfhood. And what we try to do theoretically, either in laboratories or when we engage in some sort of armchair psychology or philosophy. So I think that I'm very sympathetic to scientific findings that indicate that no substantival self is necessary. But on the other hand, I think, and I have argued so in a number of publications to produce some sort of advertisement in the middle of the talk, that the need for the existence of an individual self couldn't be just dismissed easily. And Moreover, aside from that, as philosophers, we are interested in the ontological question of the existence of the self, what there exists. And if we take what Metzinger and Gallagher say seriously, it seems that there is some sort of conflict between what they say. So, eliminativism, for example, says that there are no such things as selves. Pluralism, on the other hand, says that there are diverse number of the selves or self aspect that exist together. So which one is true? And it leads to some sort of metaphysical underdetermination. We couldn't make our mind whether the self doesn't exist at all or it is many diverse aspects. And as philosophers, even though scientists may not need this kind of neatness, as philosophers, we like our ontology to make some sense. So we have to know which picture is true, on which one we have to put our ontological money, which one could be supported ontologically. And these pictures are conflicting. So a suggestion here that is inspired by works of Luciano Floridi, who is an information theorist and a philosopher of information, and James Ladyman and a few others, is to try to conceive of the self in terms of an informational structure rather than a substance. The gain of doing so is that we still have some sort of unified entity to put at the center of our ontology of the self. There is something that could underpin diverse aspects of the self and combine them together. So eliminativism says that there are no such things as selves, but we know that if there are no such things as selves, what is the subject of our scientific enterprises or neuroscientific enterprises, which are about the notion of the self? And Metzinger actually have a smart answer for that. He says that the subject is self-model rather than the self, and for our philosophical and scientific purposes, the self-model could play the role of the self. But the tricky point here is that we didn't actually eliminate the self substance. What we did was to reduce it to another conception of the self. So the self is not literally eliminated. And a part of what I do is to try to specify this structure of what he calls the self model. And Gallagher says that there are different aspects of the self. So, but he doesn't speak much about the relation. To be fair, he speaks about the dynamical relation, but doesn't go too far in specifying this dynamical relation. So having a structural conception of the self, conceiving of the self as an informational structure gives us the bliss of both worlds. In terms of eliminativism and self-model, it helps us to specify this structure of the self-model. And with regard to pluralism, it helps us to account for the relation between diverse aspects of the self without contriving anything such as a substantive self. So the basic idea here comes from information theory, saying that explanatory, predictory, successful models of the selfhood, meaning self and its properties, are informative about the relation that's obtained between informational objects that constitute what we call the self for practical purposes. So the main idea here is that the self is an informational structure rather than the substance in the classical Aristotelian self. So we didn't revert it to substantivalism, we didn't contrive anything such as a substance. I can see that there is a message here. All right, I will answer to that question.
But we will answer them at the end, Majid.
Right, yes, precisely. It is what I tried to do. So, we didn't return to the substance, but the unity of the aspect of the self is retained here. So we had a neat subject of ontological commitment, which is important for us very much. But the main question, the more interesting question that also was, I think that has been mentioned in one of the questions that I read, was to how to identify this structure. And this is the more work. So everyone could come and claim that, all right, the self is a structure. We are happy, but it doesn't make much difference. What's important? devil is in the detail. And the important thing is how to specify this structure. And I can specify that at two levels, and this is where the helomorphism, Aristotelian notion of helomorphism return. So at the physical level, we could specify that at the level of information processing at cortical midline structure. So that is to say, we could specify the self in terms of processing of self-related information in cortical midline structure. So cortical midline structure are amongst the most ancient brain structures that are evolved in primates. It is not only cortical midline structure, it is also mirror neuron system. And both of them, cortical midline structure and mirror neuron system, are part of this default mood network. And there are good experimental reasons for assuming that self-related information processing, and part of it came to light in light of researches by Georg Nordhoff and Bernful and others. And I can elaborate on the experimental research that supports this, that the information processing that is related to self, to help us to identify ourselves, come in terms of information processing in cortical midline structure, which consists of medial prefrontal cortex and anterior cortex and some other parts of the brain, basically as the name indicates, of course, the midline neuronal parts. And the other part of the brain that engage in this form of processing is mirror neuron system, because there are social aspects in the self. So the self is not just one single isolated entity. There are social aspects of the self, and information processing in mirror neuron system too contributes to fleshing out the social aspect of the self. So to recap quickly, the self is an informational structure. Informational structure takes place here on the basis of information processing in the cortical midline structure and mirror neuron system. And this brings us to the notion of information. What kind of information is at issue here? Is it the classical Shannon's theory of information in terms of mathematical theory of communication, or are we speaking about something else? And if it is theoretical, and I think that again it is related to one of the questions that I've seen. So when we speak of the informational structure of the self, are we speaking, and these are ontological questions, the same question that have been also triggering Aristotle, but we are asking them as philosopher in a new context. So if there is the self as an informational structure, does it mean that the self is something abstract, or we are speaking of some abstract mathematical quality? Because we know that if we identify information in terms of Shannon's mathematical theory of communication, in terms of communication in a noisy channel, we are speaking basically about some mathematical entity. If so, how it is related to what I said about cortical midline structure and mirror neuron system? I think that I have to finish here and leave room for, but a part of my research engages with identifying the informational structure of the self in terms of embodied information rather than in terms of purely mathematical information. And this has been unfolded in terms of the free energy principle, which is not the physical Gibbs free energy principle. It is a notion derived from information theory in terms of defining free energy as an information theoretic measure which bounds or limits the surprise on sampling some data, giving a general model in light of recent work of Carl Friston and colleagues. So in some sense, we left substantivalism. On the other hand, there were these interesting scientific images of the self, but they lack something significant, at least from an ontological perspective. And part of the activity, part of the research that has been reported in this talk is concerned with contriving a reliable and unified ontological conception of the self that doesn't revert to substantivalism, and acknowledges the scientific facts, scientific reports, but at the same time tries to provide some sort of ontologically reliable and unified conception of the self. So I think that I have to. I think that I have to finish right now I have 10 minutes, I think, for question and answer. So I thank you very much, and I'm ready to take question and answer them if I can.
Okay, thank you, Majid. I think if you click the question answer, then you have to be reading the question for the recording, and then continue answering.
All right, so I have to read from the question and answer. During your research, what is the topmost motivation of the self that you observe?
And there's a continuation of the question.
What is the relationship between the soul and the existence? That I do not know. So the other question is what is the relation between the soul and the existence? I do not know about, if by speaking of the soul, this is a theological question, I do not know much about that. But if we are speaking of mind or the self in the ordinary scientific sense, it seems that for Friston and colleagues, it seems that the organism, this idea of free energy principle and trying to put an upper bound on surprise, mainly consists of the organism attempt to find evidence for their own existence, because they are making models of their environment and they are trying to have their model confirmed through an information processing mechanism, the information processing mechanism of reducing prediction error. So this speaks directly to some Bayesian accounts of information theory, Bayesian, basically Bayesian, in terms of approximate Bayesianism. So it has something to do with the existence, but I think that it needs more discussion and more clarification to question. And what you know, any study which are use computational methods as an atomic scale about the decision-making mechanisms of people. I know about this question. The question is, do you know any studies which are used computational methods as an atomic scale about decision-making mechanisms of people? I do not know of such studies. I know that there are people such as Roger Penrose from Oxford and a few other people who are trying to account for decision-making and free will in terms of subatomic mechanisms, but I do not know whether it has been accompanied with any sort of research or experimental studies, and I'm not very optimistic about that line of research, to be quite honest, for independent reason. But about the first question during your researches, what is the topmost motivation of the self that you observe? Perhaps the sense of agency could be identified as some sort of topmost motivation and survival. So purposefulness, agency, and it seems that in the context of free energy principle, it is possible to account for purposefulness in terms of organisms that could form, and again, it comes in terms of approximate Bayesianism and some sort of Bayesian conception of information theory. Some organisms could model not only their environment to themselves, but they also are able to model diverse consequences of actions to themselves, and they could choose between these diverse consequences. So it gives them some sort of purposefulness and agency, and I think that and there are many theories that explain how this choice between different diverse consequences of action, this sense of purposefulness, could be related to important issues such as consciousness and self-consciousness that are amongst the most important properties of the self. So I would say that the topmost motivation of the self is to realize, to manifest sense of agency and purposefulness. And I think that there are a good theoretical explanation, and by speaking of theoretical, I'm speaking about computational neuroscience, in terms of computational neuroscience, of the relation between how the organism models the environment to itself and its purposefulness and agency and self-consciousness. I don't know whether it makes much sense. So as I say, I mainly introduced there a meaningful discourse could take place between philosophers and neuroscientists and information theorists rather than providing answers. So I think that this is an important question, and I think that answering that demands a different thought about this idea of free energy principle, predictive processing, and how they contribute to the formation of the self and its phenomenal properties, what we call its phenomenal properties, such as consciousness and self-consciousness and purposefulness. So Carl Friston and some of his colleagues, also some philosophers such as Andy Clark and Jacob Howe, provided, I think, important insights into this issue. All right. So,
okay, thank you. I think we answered all questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you very much for listening to me.
We are on time, actually. If you have no more questions, we can give a break.
All right. So I have naturally no questions.
You don't, of course, but the others.
All right.
Okay.
Thank you very much.